To the representatives of the American people, the statement began, written with a calmness that seemed to settle over the room like a cold wind. Samson spoke of being purchased, reshaped, studied. He described laboratories where men were measured like livestock and injected with substances whose names were chosen to hide their purpose. He wrote of how the enhancement process sharpened his understanding not only of himself, but of the nature of the society that made such experiments possible. We have seen, the statement continued, that the principles of liberty this nation claims to revere are not denied only to slaves, but to all whom power finds convenient to reduce. We have learned that strength alone does not make a man free. Freedom is a choice, and I have made mine. Samson's demands followed, each sentence careful and deliberate: the end of all enhancement programs, the release of all subjects still held in facilities, recognition of enhanced individuals as free human beings under the law. If these demands are refused, he wrote, we will take whatever actions are necessary to secure our freedom. The chamber shook with reaction, shouts, threats, denials. Southern delegates called for Samson's head. Northern delegates, pale and silent, saw in the statement the undeniable truth of a system that had grown monstrous in its secrecy. Within days, the government's response hardened into a new posture. President James Buchanan authorized a national manhunt for enhanced subjects. Bounties rose to sums unimaginable only a year before. Federal marshals coordinated with local militias. Newspapers printed warnings. But the enhanced were no longer scattered fugitives. They appeared near cities, Washington, New York, Philadelphia, not to attack, but to watch, to measure, to understand the architecture of the country that had made them. Then, on May 15, 1859, in an act that would become legend even among those who doubted the entire story, Samson came to Washington. Not in hiding, not at night. He walked openly down Pennsylvania Avenue, an enormous figure wrapped in a long coat, his stride unhurried, his posture calm. Those who saw him said he moved like a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. Crowds parted. Soldiers hesitated. Some ran. He climbed the Capitol steps and requested, simply, almost politely, to speak with the committee. His request was denied. He did not argue. He stood for a moment on the marble terrace, looking down at the city laid out like a map of contradictions. Before he left, he pressed his hand into the marble itself. Later, men would gather around the mark. 5 deep grooves, each one carved as if the stone were no harder than clay. Below the handprint, he left a final message, marked with the symbol of broken shackles. The experiment is over. The specimens have become the scientists. And then he was gone. His disappearance was immediate and complete, but the echo of his presence lingered like the scent of a storm long after it has passed. Every official involved in the program now understood what had been born inside their laboratories. Not a monster or a weapon, but a mind sharpened into something extraordinary and fully awake. The government responded with panic disguised as purpose. The War Department drafted contingency plans they barely understood. Special units were assembled. Files were sealed, then hidden, then forgotten. But actions taken in haste often reveal more than they conceal. Because while Washington scrambled to regain control, Samson and his followers moved into the next phase of a plan that had taken shape long before the first iron bar had bent under his hands. And in the quiet rooms where deals are made, the outlines of a secret settlement, the Washington Compact, began to take form. What began as a local horror in the sticky air of an Arkansas plantation had, within a year, become a national contagion. a set of questions that could not be answered by more rewards or sealed records. Men in offices in Washington and Boston, who had once written clinical letters to explain their experiments, now found their work turned back like a mirror, reflecting the cruelty behind their justifications. And at the center of that mirror stood a name: Samson. The questions that had been circling the Samson affair finally burst into the open in the spring of 1859, and for the first time, they did so not in whispered conversations behind plantation doors, but beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Capitol itself. The spark came in the form of an unmarked package, delivered to the office of Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a man who had spent decades fighting the institution of slavery with the quiet relentlessness of someone who understood the cost of looking away. Inside the package were documents that should never have left the vaults where they were kept. Hundreds of pages, some in the careful script of medical men, others in the bureaucratic shorthand of clerks. Correspondence, ledgers of procurement, research logs, and above all, a roster, a list of every enhanced subject created across nearly a decade of experimentation. More than 300 names. Their origins, their enhancement levels, their locations, their status, captured, escaped, or terminated. At the top of the list was the name already whispered in fear and wonder across the South: Samson, marked not only as level highest, but as active resistance leader. Giddings recognized immediately the significance of what lay before him. In the documents he held, slavery was no longer merely cruelty supported by law. It was revealed as a machinery of experimentation, a system that had pushed human bodies past the brink in the pursuit of strength, obedience, and profit. He demanded hearings. Southerners resisted with predictable fury, claiming that any interference in plantation science was an affront to states' rights. But Northern representatives rallied behind him, and so by late April, the first hearings on the Human Enhancement Program convened. Public, packed, and volatile. Dr. Marcus Kleinman was the first major witness. He entered the chamber with the somberness of a man whose life's work had been dragged into daylight. In his accented English, he spoke of humanitarian intentions, of strengthening bodies to lessen suffering. But under cross-examination, the varnish peeled away. Kleinman admitted that the chemical regimens, the physical conditioning, the psychological pressures placed on subjects had transformed human beings in ways the researchers themselves scarcely understood. Enhanced individuals exceeded human limits by ratios that once would have belonged to myth. Their minds grew sharper, faster, more independent. The subject designated Samson, Kleinman murmured, surpassed every threshold we believed possible. The next phase of the hearings plunged deeper into the machinery behind the program. General Winfield Scott, whose presence commanded a hush, revealed that military interests had funded enhancement research for years. Volunteer soldiers, convicts, immigrants, these too had been folded quietly into the program. The results had been disastrous. Enhanced soldiers questioned orders, deserted in coordinated groups, or reacted with unpredictable bursts of autonomy that no chain of command could manage. Some had to be executed. Others disappeared into the world, ghosts with capacities that exceeded any nation's ability to control them. But the most seismic shock arrived on the third day of hearings. It came not from a witness, but from a statement, one delivered through intermediaries whose identities remained carefully hidden. It was a message from Samson himself. What Pinkerton and the underground networks discovered next changed the frame. These enhanced individuals were not merely stronger, they were thinking differently. Jupiter's late-night observations, numbers in the dirt, murmured phrases that read like orders, found corroboration in reports from other places. Men who had been treated as specimens began to communicate, to coordinate, to plan. A quiet infrastructure emerged among those who refused to be catalogued. Abolitionists, free blacks, sympathetic whites, and the runaway subjects themselves. They called it the Freedom Chain, a pragmatic, secretive network that taught escapees how to hide, how to travel, how to survive without the tracks authorities expected. The first coordinated liberations arrived like a new weather pattern, not isolated storms, but a shifting front. Camden, in southern Arkansas, became a grim headline one October night. Marcus Henley's plantation, a model of cotton wealth, had taken on 3 new laborers from Louisiana: Caesar, Goliath, Titan, names that read like a ledger's shorthand for danger. The overseer's testimony was simple, spoken in the blunt language of a man who believed he had seen the limits of human capacity. Shackles did not break. They were twisted and peeled apart as if cast from soft clay. Locks that had held men for years were contorted into useless shapes. The men moved with a coordination that suggested prior planning. They left the plantation with maps and supplies, not panic. Within weeks, similar accounts arrived from Mississippi and Louisiana. Research facilities stripped of records and research notes, holding cells emptied without a sound. Equipment left in surreal shapes where iron had been bent into tangles that looked like obscene modern sculpture. It was as if the escaped subjects traveled with the intent to destroy the tools of their own degradation. The pattern suggested a central awareness. Someone or something was directing these raids with an intelligence that exceeded the simple will to flee. By late 1858, the tempo intensified. Reports came to Little Rock and then to Washington. Sightings of a colossal figure moving through the woods at night. Footprints that sank too deep to be ordinary. Trees uprooted where no storm had passed. Thomas Bogard, a bounty hunter hardened by months on the trail, swore he had seen Samson with his own eyes, standing on a rocky ledge like a statue. He described not merely size, but a look that read calculation. A man who could decide in a moment whether killing was worth the cost. Samson, Bogard claimed, spoke with the soft politeness of a well-taught man, telling the hunter plainly that the problem was not the strong among them, but the system that made strength into property. Elsewhere, reports moved from plantation to research facility. In New Orleans, in Natchez, in the hidden compounds of the South, the same symbol appeared. The mark of broken shackles scored into walls and laboratory benches, left for the world to see. It was both a signature and a warning. The acts were surgical, targeted. Destroy records, free subjects, leave the sign. No blood, no slaughter, just precision and escape. Each incident deepened the dawning terror among the men who had funded and profited from the enhancement programs. The panic reached a fevered pitch on New Year's Eve at a remote military-run facility in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee. There, a program promised soldiers improved endurance in exchange for service. A line between volunteer and specimen blurred by secrecy. Survivors would later describe an operation executed with military efficiency. Communications disabled first. Research materials destroyed. Subjects freed. Not a single life lost. The message carved into the laboratory wall in letters gouged 2 inches deep would be read in Washington with a mix of awe and dread. The chains are broken. The strong shall no longer serve the weak. A symbol of broken shackles finished the declaration. Word of the Tennessee raid traveled faster than any hunter. It crossed state lines and reached the ears of men who had not believed in miracles until they were forced to believe in consequences. By the time winter wore thin, The Samson problem had become an agenda item folded into military dispatches and whispered alongside the other crises that would fracture a nation. The attacks no longer looked like the desperate acts of scattered fugitives. They had the hallmarks of an insurgency, coordinated, strategic, and driven by a leadership that combined brute capability with a moral clarity that unsettled those who had once justified the work as progress. Questions arrived with those documents that Arkansas was not prepared to answer. Had Samson been the subject of experiments? Had Ruddle been working with Northern scientists to manufacture strength? The state moved quickly to constrain inquiry. Files were sealed, papers taken into federal custody, witnesses dispersed or sold away. The reward was quietly withdrawn, and the story began its long drift into rumor and selective memory. But in slave quarters, in whispers passed along riverbanks and rail lines, in the secret letters of abolitionists and the locked files of government clerks, a larger and more dangerous question spread. If Samson had been made by men in the name of science, what else might exist in the archives of the powerful? When the trail turned from rumor to evidence, it did so with the careful, relentless steps of men who made a living finding what others wanted hidden. The Pinkerton Detective Agency slipped into the story like a shadow cast by the new industrial age. Professional, implacable, and uninterested in the local comforts that had smothered the first inquiries. Alan Pinkerton dispatched operatives to follow the paper trail backward, from Rutledge's sealed desk to the bankrupt plantation in Louisiana, where Samson had first been recorded as unusual, and from there into a tangle of private laboratories, military contracts, and northern universities that preferred to think of themselves as above the messy necessities of Southern commerce. What Detective James Hawthorne found in Bayou country south of New Orleans did more than confirm local suspicions. It gave them teeth. The Frenchman Boudreau, who had sold Samson with a buyer beware clause, spoke in the thin, defensive voice of a man who had handled money to make a problem disappear. He admitted that Samson had been part of what they called an enhancement protocol, a mix of chemical treatments, strict physical regimens, and nutritional experiments administered under the cover of a health program. Boudreau's plantation, he told Hawthorne, had been one of many testing grounds for the Southern Health Initiative, a project ostensibly aimed at reducing disease but in practice designed to extract more labor from human bodies. Investors from the North financed the work. The stated aim was productivity. The hidden consequence was something else entirely. The Pinkertons followed the money and discovered names in the margins no one in Arkansas had dared imagine. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, a German émigré with a facility in Boston, laboratories in Philadelphia and Baltimore, shipping manifests with obscure chemical names, correspondence that moved in a steady, clinical tone between laboratories and plantation studies. Where the local sheriff saw a violent death and a missing man, Pinkerton's reports sketched a pattern of intentional transformation. Men and women pushed beyond ordinary human limits by people who wrote about their subjects as one writes about machines. Detective Sarah Chen slipped into Kleinman's Boston facility under the pretense of a nurse seeking work. What she found was a bureaucracy of alteration. Patient files coded by number, regimented exercise programs, chemical baths, records of gains in strength and endurance measured in precise percentages. Her notes, kept hidden in the margins of Pinkerton dispatches, recorded in a quiet hand an observation that would chill the agency when assembled with other testimony. Some subjects showed not only increased force, but an intellectual clarity and a resistance to authority that made them dangerous in a way no laboratory had anticipated. The experiments did not remain local. Kleinman's letters to Rutledge were explicit. He wrote of limits reached, of psychological breaking points worth watching, of data that could inform not only agricultural efficiency, but military applications. The tone between scientist and plantation owner in those pages was businesslike. Improvement, observation, a mutual agreement to push a subject until something new was revealed. In private, Kleinman spoke of soldiers, of reconnaissance, of men who could operate where ordinary men could not. What started as an effort to make labor more efficient began to look like the deliberate manufacture of a new human possibility. The consequences arrived with the first escapes. In 1854, enhanced subjects on Boudreaux's plantation seized a night and fled. The revolt left overseers dead and the program shuttered in panic. Some escapees were recaptured and disposed of with the economy of silence that ran through the slaveholding states. Others were sold with carefully drafted disclaimers. Samson's transfer to Rutland was one such transaction. Hawthorne's interviews suggested the pattern repeated elsewhere. Facilities across the South conducting variations of the same regimen. A loose network of investors and men who rationalized their work as progress. Guests arrived in a steady procession. Among them were half a dozen of Arkansas's most prominent men: Judge Cornelius Dillingham, Samuel Vaughan of Helena, Dr. Nathaniel Peyton from Memphis. Professor Emanuel Voss took notes in a clipped Germanic hand. The carriage house was lit, the apparatus a theater of iron and oak. Samson stood within it, massive and composed, a figure waiting at the edge of some interior calculation. At first, the evening unfolded as Rutland intended. Samson lifted weights, bent iron, split oak beams, the crowd oohing and applauding at the display of brute capacity. But then the colonel's curiosities hardened into demands. He pushed the tests beyond spectacle into strain. He asked for heavier lifts, thicker iron, greater demonstration of the endurance that made his journals valuable. Around 10:30, with the room full and the torches throwing long shadows, Rutland gestured toward an iron flywheel from a cotton gin, a heavy, circular thing that had been hauled into the carriage house for effect. He told Samson to lift it. For a long breath, everyone watched Samson study the wheel, then the colonel, then the expectant faces. When he spoke, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. "No, sir." The room recoiled. In that place and time, a slave's refusal was a rupture. Refusal demanded immediate and brutal retribution. Rutledge's face went through surprise into something like cold fury. He pressed. The crowd wanted spectacle. Judge Dillingham attempted a quiet intervention, perhaps enough for one evening. Rutland waved the dissent away and ordered the test again. Samson refused once more. This time his voice carried not only refusal, but a clarity that unsettled every finely trained observer. He smiled. Witnesses would later describe it as the most terrible expression they had ever seen. And then he moved. In 3 surrendered, impossibly quick strides, he closed the distance between them. There was a sound, later compared to the noise of a strong branch shattering. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge's neck broke with an audible snap. He died instantly. The ease of it, the effortless cruelty with which the man who had measured others as specimens was felled, was what spun the night into legend. Samson stood over the body like a man who had expected the result, hands cupped as if holding something delicate that had simply given way. He spoke with elocution that did not match the assumptions of those who had purchased him. "Gentlemen," he said, "I suggest you leave now." The hall dissolved into chaos. Men who had lived by rules of rank and pretense forgot protocol as they fled. Class collapsed into panic. In minutes, the plantation was emptied of its invited guests. By dawn, the carriage house was cold and the torches dead. Colonel Rutledge's body was gone. Samson had vanished. What followed was a searching that would come to resemble ritual. Deputized parties scouring fields and riverbanks, ponds dragged, footpaths combed. The house slaves' testimony was maddening in its consistency. They had heard voices, seen lights, but had not intervened. Jupiter the blacksmith spoke more plainly. He described Samson's strange endurance and the late-night numbers he'd scratched into the dirt, the foreign-sounding murmurs that were like orders. The physical evidence in the carriage house told an incomplete story. Scattered weights, bent iron, split beams, and those handprints sunk so deep into oak, it seemed as if the wood had been impressed by something not wholly human. There was no blood, no footprints leading away, and no body. Within hours, the case became a spectacle of its own. Telegrams and riders carried the news to Little Rock. Sheriff Thomas Brage arrived with deputies and militia. Bounty posters were printed. By dawn, the rumor net had already begun to do the work people do when facts are inadequate. It filled the spaces with speculation. Yet the most unsettling discovery came when Rutledge's estate was finally opened. A false bottom in the colonel's desk yielded papers that eroded the tidy explanations authorities preferred. Correspondence with northern universities, receipts for obscure chemical compounds, a bill of lading for specialized pharmaceutical equipment from New Orleans dated 2 weeks before Samson's arrival. Most damning of all, a contract with Meridian Research Associates of Boston, ongoing physiological assessment and enhancement protocols, bearing a signature that some house servants said matched Samson's own hand. In the autumn of 1857, in a part of Arkansas where the river cut slow and wide through cotton bottoms, something happened the county tried very hard to forget. On a Thanksgiving night at Rutledge Plantation, a man called Samson is said to have killed his master with such casual violence that the story slipped beyond ordinary cruelty and entered the province of the impossible. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, a man who measured people as if they were specimens, allegedly had his neck snapped like a dry twig. Those who watched would later insist the force required was not natural. A skull crushed with one hand, iron bent as if it were soft, palm marks sunk deep into oak beams that would not fade with time. The official record closed as if by a surgeon's stitch. Locked files, silenced witnesses, erased newspaper accounts. But the memory of that night refused to stay buried. Rutledge Plantation sat 20 miles south of Little Rock, where the Arkansas River laced through some of the richest cotton lands in the South. By 1857, the estate sprawled over 3,000 acres, maintained by nearly 200 enslaved people who lived beneath the shadow of a Greek revival mansion. Colonel Rutledge himself was a study in contradiction. Massachusetts-born, a lawyer by training, he had come south and chosen the plantation life rather than inheriting it. His cruelty was methodical, clinical even. He kept breeding charts, logged punishments, kept leather-bound journals on human output, as if the people who worked his land were machines with variable tolerances. Neighbors whispered that he ran his place like an experiment. The enslaved community at Rutledge lived in two worlds: the field hands in rough cabins by the river's edge, the house servants who moved, always careful and invisible, closer to the main house. They traded recipes for survival the way other people trade letters. Small, secret transmissions of knowledge and endurance. In that community, Samson stood apart. Not merely because he towered over most men at 6'4", but because his history read like a fragment of a different book. Bought 3 years earlier from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana, the bill of sale that came with him was oddly explicit. Strong constitution, unusual physical capabilities, possible medical anomaly. Buyer assumes all risks. The seller, a Frenchman named Boudreau, had seemed eager to be rid of him. Samson never told his story aloud, but other people noticed. He could labor 16 hours without the slackness that flattened ordinary men, lift bales 2 men would strain at, his hands rings of callus like horn. Jupiter, the plantation blacksmith, swore Samson could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, a miracle kept carefully hidden from the overseer's eye. There was more than brute force, too. In the quiet that follows midnight work, some said they saw him scratching symbols in the dirt outside his cabin. Not letters, but strange formulae. There was a literacy in his gaze that did not belong to someone born to whips and auction blocks. Ruttles took interest, the kind of interest that feels between curiosity and ownership. He read phrenology journals and agricultural periodicals, the papers of men who liked to name and rank difference. To him, Samson was not a person, but a specimen worth observation. He began conducting strength assessments in the old carriage house. Weights, anvils, tree trunks, iron machinery. He timed Samson, recorded outputs, wrote observations in a hand that never trembled. These assessments escalated into demonstrations. Guests were invited. Planters from Memphis and New Orleans, a German professor from St. Louis, a physician whose work traded on the science of racial difference. The carriage house was cleared, torches set, apparatus arranged for a spectacle that promised to convert the colonel's private notes into public renown. By early autumn, something had shifted in Samson. Those who worked with him spoke of a restraint not born of fear, but of calculation, a man conserving energy as if for a particular moment. Jupiter later told investigators that Samson had begun asking questions about the plantation's layout, about who moved where and when, about which house servants had access to private rooms. He listened, the way a man stores pieces for a plan. Ruttles planned his grand Thanksgiving demonstration with all the modesty of someone who believed science could sanctify his property. Invitations went out. Dishes were ordered from Baltimore. A menu was rehearsed as if ritual. House servants moved like ghosts through kitchens under Molly Kittenden's command, preparing a feast intended to seat 50. Samson was assigned to prepare the grounds, the wraparound veranda, the oil lamps, the final touches that would frame his display. To anyone watching closely, his movements were less willing than precise, not unwilling, but preserving.